Like every other martial arts YouTuber, I started my channel thinking, surely MMA has shown people which martial arts are scams. I'm sure people don't make idiotic arguments anymore. And like every other martial arts YouTuber, I was dead wrong. With the sheer volume of misguided, stupid, and outright fraudulent martial artists out there, it's up to you to cut through the bullcrap and figure out who's right and who's dumb. If you want a breakdown of what constitutes a bad martial artist, see part 1. Also, standard disclaimer that none of the individuals in this video are necessarily bad martial artists, but the statements themselves are definitely red flags. This phrase means that someone would rather be charged with assault or homicide than die in a self-defense scenario. This is a textbook example of a false dichotomy, and it's typically used to justify an unwarranted escalation of force. It's the idea that you should always resort to lethal force and the legal consequences should be ignored in the interest of preserving your own safety. A drunk starts a fight with you in a bar? Shoot him 28 times in the face. A guy in a hoodie's been following you for a few blocks? Looks like it's time for death. An old lady looks at you funny? Sorry, Dolores, but I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. She could have had a gun, I don't know. Taken to its logical extension, it's easy to see why this statement is ridiculous. You can't simply assume that every potential threat requires lethal force. You have to make an honest assessment of the scenario. If a 90-year-old lady hits you with her purse, do you get to drop a tactical nuke on her pruny face? Or do you have to be an adult and walk away? Remember that the goal of self-defense is to keep yourself safe. Prison is not a safe place. If you end up in prison, you're bad at self-defense. What you need to do is respond with only the necessary and appropriate level of force. If you're judged by 12 or carried by 6, then you failed at self-defense. In fact, if you commit unjustified homicide, you are the kind of person the rest of us are trying to defend ourselves from. Responding to everything with lethal force means you're the bad guy. People like to parrot this phrase when they're too lazy or too stupid to make an honest attempt at threat assessment. They believe it because it seems like an easy mental shortcut, but there are no shortcuts to violence. This statement is used by people arguing that big, bulky muscles will slow you down and therefore make you a less effective fighter. It's typically used by traditional martial artists and occasionally boxers.
I'm of the old school train of thought that you should not be lifting heavy weights. Well, I know for a fact that it dulls your fast twitch reflexes, will limit your range of motion.
This is one of those things that could technically be construed as true, but not really because there are two very important caveats. We've all seen footage of massive bodybuilders that can barely clap their hands or go up a flight of stairs. But they've been training for many years specifically to gain mass, and they're using more drugs than I can pronounce. The idea that lifting weights will accidentally give you too much muscle is laughable. Do you know what you get when you casually lift weights without specialized training regimens or supplements? You get this. You know what no one's ever told me? Gee, you have too much muscle. That's never happened. I dream of it happening, but it's never happened. The second caveat is that there are different kinds of strength and muscle. When we think of big muscles, we usually think of bodybuilders and powerlifters. They're often big and slow, but that's because they train to lift big things slowly. If you instead train for explosive power, it makes you faster and lets you hit harder. The idea that boxers shouldn't have big muscles is refuted by the fact that most of the best boxers in history have pretty big muscles. They're not bodybuilders, but they're probably bigger than you are. And when you look at MMA, the top fighters get even bigger because strength becomes essential the moment any amount of grappling happens. So while certain types and amounts of muscle can slow you down, it's not something that you're ever going to achieve by accident. To reach a point of inverse returns, you'd probably need to be on steroids. For all intents and purposes, lifting weights is only going to make you better. People that say otherwise are just making up an excuse as to why they're flabby. First of all, I made a video on why virtually all strategies to fight multiple opponents are stupid, but let's put that aside for a moment. Martial artists typically like to use this excuse to explain why their moves and strategies don't work in sparring. They try to convince you that these moves aren't meant to be used against one attacker, they're meant to be used against a bunch of them. They're specialized for fighting a small army, I really hate that I have to explain this, but anything that works badly against one attacker will utterly fail against multiple attackers. And anything that works well against a group of people should work really, really well against one person. For example, you know what works well against multiple people? A gun. But a gun isn't any worse against one person. In fact, it works even better because there's only one target. And you can pick any weapon for this. Swords, knives, tanks, planes, tactical, nukes, it doesn't matter. It's always easier against a single target. So why are martial arts moves any different? It's still a tool that you use to win. If you can fight 4 or 5 people, then you should be able to beat the living daylights out of one person with a hand tied behind your back. Some arts will talk about shelling up to survive an onslaught or how to fight back from there. But that's just trying to sell you a panic instinct by pretending it's a skill. Actual fighters know not to use those positions because they can be easily exploited. And if they can be exploited by one person, do you think they can't be exploited by 5? If someone can genuinely defend themselves from a group of attackers, then they can easily defend themselves from a professional MMA fighter. But they don't because they can't, because they're lying to themselves. This is an empty advertising promise. It's what you say when there's nothing good to say. It's the participation trophy of martial arts because every halfway decent art already does this. When you take a boxing class, which do you learn first? Lomachenko's footwork patterns or how to jab? The jab, obviously. Combat sports already teach you the basic steps to have a functional style in a short amount of time. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu starts you off with basic positions and 1 or 2 reliable submissions. Wrestling gives you a handful of fundamental takedowns and maybe a couple pins. Teaching you basic skills in a short amount of time is something every art already does. But the arts that advertise it are just drawing attention away from the fact that they don't have any advanced moves. The advantage of actual martial arts is that they can quickly give you a basic game, but can also give you an intricate and advanced game if you train for long enough. If your entire art is based around relaying basic skills, then all you will ever have are basic skills. You're not really teaching basic skills, you just have a basic martial art. If you want to actually be good, learn a combat sport. Dude, me and my instructor have won dozens of street fights. Like 1 billion of them. Probably all of the street fights that have ever happened, actually.
And obviously, I've been in a scrap or 2 on the street, where anything goes.
I've been in over 40 street fights, undefeated by the way.
Anyone that claims that they or their instructor have been in 10, 100, or 1,000 street fights is admitting that they're stupid. First of all, nobody wins dozens of fights in a row. If you're thinking of boxers with incredible winning streaks, remember that they handpick weak opponents with stylistic disadvantages in order to pad their record. Either those street fights are interspersed with a ton of losses, or they specifically target people weaker than them, which means they're the instigator and should be in jail. Or they're lying through their teeth. That's also an option. Second of all, it's important to remember that the first step to self-defense is to not get in fights with people. Anyone that lives in a modern first world country and has been in dozens of street fights is terrible at self-defense. You know how many street fights I've been in? 0, because I'm a responsible adult. If you've been in dozens of street fights, you are the reason the rest of us have to learn self-defense. Because we might run into violent idiots like you. Now, how many street fights someone has been in is usually used to prove that what they're teaching works. But just because you've used something in a street fight doesn't mean it's a good move. You might be unusually good at that move. Or you might have picked fights with especially vulnerable people. Or you might just be a big, strong person with physical advantages over everyone else. I could go out right now to the local playground and use garbage moves on every toddler, soccer mom, and grandma I see. But it doesn't mean that any of those moves are practical or that I'm good at fighting. It doesn't matter if you've used a move once or 1,000 times. It's still anecdotal evidence which fails to control for variables. It's irrelevant. All those assaults, and the only thing you proved is that you're stupid. You know, at the end of part 1, I asked people to comment things that bad martial artists say, and I only got a couple of decent responses. But I ended up getting way more material from actual bad martial artists genuinely arguing with me. It would seem that only idiots can think like idiots. Smart people pretending to be idiots just isn't the same. So comment below if you can link me to an idiot, because I'm on my way to part 3.